And
Is
we
that
know
like
we're live.
is that like a furry octopus next to you, George?
Yeah, yeah. I was like,
Oh,
what
this
is
yeah,
that?
this is my cat that wants to
All
be
I
in
can
my
see is
face all the time.
the tail in the
Yeah,
frame.
His
that's
coworker, works with furry octopus, and during the day they just lightly caress him. Be like,
That's a good name for a company.
yeah.
yeah, it is.
Can you approve my pull request, George?
Okay, that's a furry octopus. Good name for a company. That's as good a way to start as any.
That's right. All right, welcome to Virtual Brown Bag, March 8th, 2016. And do the normal spill. This will be, what, the third week now where we have guests come speak and we just chat about whatever's interesting to them and what they're working on. And this week's guest is Ben Scheirman, who's a longtime friend, known him for many, many years, runs NSScreencast, and does full stack everything with development. So the rare iOS developer that actually knows other languages and does other things. Sometimes they're like, "Do you do anything else?" He's like, "No, I just do mobile." You're like, "How do you do that?" So what we're going to talk about today is really up to Ben. I think last time we talked was about maybe doing like Swift on Linux and Unix stuff.
Yeah.
But other stuff has happened since we scheduled this, so lots of things to share and talk about. And obviously, virtualbrownbag.com and the meeting.virtualbrownbag.com. You can join in, ask questions. We also record this, so you can watch it another date. And I'll make sure to plug here, Ben, NSScreencast. They're awesome. You should go take a look, try them out, and learn you some mobile development. All right, there we go.
Yeah. So just one caveat. If you go on the Slack, which you can get to from our main room, there in the header for that there is a Google form, and we are taking suggestions for things you want to hear about, things you would like to present about, and any other suggestions. Period. I'm plugging that because no one's filled it out yet. so let's do that.
That's one of those features that people ask for it, and then after you put it up there, like nothing happens, and you're like, "This is why we didn't have it."
Oh.
Well, thanks for having me.
Get started.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. So, what's on your mind this week?
Well, I spent a sort of a furious week trying to get a site launched with Swift on Linux, and the process was enlightening and painful. As is with this is like this total bleeding edge. We knew Swift was going to be open sourced as of WWDC, which was June last year. They said it will be open sourced, and then they gave us a time frame before the end of the year, and then it got to, I think it was December 22nd, so they were cutting it really close. And so everybody kind of knew this was coming. You started to see people think about how to build a web server in Swift and how to do this and that, just been knowing that it's going to work on Linux. But a lot of the details were not clear. And now that it's happened, and some people have graciously spent a whole lot of time trying to, get things working. Now we have those details. So the language itself is pretty interesting in that it is a really new language that is taking inspiration from a number of areas. So you've got inspiration from functional languages. You've got inspiration from languages like C#. You've got inspiration from just a number of places. There's a strong desire to be type safe in the language, and also to be concise and readable. There's a lot to like about the language. However, the language itself is not that interesting unless you bring with it all of the frameworks that we have as iOS and Mac developers. The frameworks that we have are some of the best that I've ever worked with. There's so much power there. And so just the language without all the frameworks, you're like, okay, I've got strings and ints, but how do I parse dates, or how do I can I navigate between phrases in a long string? There's any number of things. So there's just a ton of good stuff. The good news is that they did port the Foundation framework. There's an open source version of the Foundation framework in Swift, so a lot of that stuff has already been implemented and we get to use. So what I thought would be kind of useful is just to start from scratch, grab a Vagrant VM and just start playing around with it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Also, like, didn't you like? So we were talking another Slack channel. Wasn't there like a perfect or API
Yes.
or something? Are you
Yes.
using that?
No. Uh,
Okay.
so I kind of went on a Twitter rant last week after trying a couple of these, and then I started looking around. And there's a whole lot of web frameworks, and it seems like there's somebody on Twitter put it in a nice way. It's like there's this land grab. Like everybody wants to be the Rails style framework for Swift, and I am totally not interested in that sort of rush to get the glory of Rails without any of the hard work. And so one of the parts, perfect may be awesome. However, the name itself and the marketing lingo on the website, it's really kind of turned me off because it's so early. And I would much rather people throw ideas out there, see what sticks before claiming that one solution is going to be the perfect one or this is going to be the, So anyway, just sort of it was marketing heavy and not a lot of examples and that sort of thing. I went the other way and I found a working example and I tried to riff on that and ran into some brick walls, which is understandable because it's so early that a lot of stuff just didn't work. So the first one I started with was Vapor. That's specifically a web framework called Vapor. And ran into a few issues with that I posted some issues on GitHub, and the owner of the project was like really quick to respond with some things. And then I gave Frank a try, and Frank is yet another sort of Sinatra-style clone. And that one seemed to be the easiest for me to get going. What I ended up building out of that was... Where do I post this link? In group chat?
Yeah, group chat. No big. I think it gets put up to. So did you? So you built it? Use the. I know you worked on this.
I built NSDateFormatter.com. For those who are unfamiliar, NSDateFormatter is a class you would use to format dates and times and parse, time strings and date strings and that sort of thing. And as with basically every platform, the syntax for doing so is kind of voodoo, and if you don't know what it is, it can be a little bit confusing. And in the Ruby community, we have foragoodsurftime.com, which is a great resource. I've used it for years and years. And it's just like a handy resource with like live formatting. And that's kind of key. Like having a handy resource is great, but if you could just do it live right there in a text box, that's even cooler. And I wanted to build this thing for a super long time. I considered running Objective-C on Linux, only to realize that NSDate Formatter wasn't part of that whole open source thing. It just didn't come together. But
I thought like Swift and Objective-C were like buddies, like C# and Visual Basic. Is that not the case? Is it?
No, it is. It is. There's a interop layer which. In fact, a lot of Swift features are there solely so that you can mix the two. Okay. If you're in a pure Swift mode, you get a lot of type safety. If you are in a bridging mode, then you lose some of that type safety, and methods get dispatched in a more dynamic way. The trend is to eventually be pure Swift, I believe. But it's going to take a long time to get there. So they needed like really good interop between Objective-C and Swift.
Maybe on another sidetrack here. So, I don't know that much about Swift. I've seen some of the syntax, but I didn't realize it was strongly typed. That's how little I know. So how do you feel about that? Coming back to it from going from C# to Ruby, and you dabble a little bit JavaScript, but now you're back to
Yeah, type safety. It is. I don't know. It's nice and it sucks at the same time because I like the fast feedback cycle of writing a little bit of code in and I mean like an actual like visually little bit of code when I write Ruby, and then I just like run a test or I run the program and see if it worked or not. Having a compiler is kind of nice. It catches a lot of these kind of stupid issues. If you can imagine how many times in Rails that you called link to, and then you forgot, is this a separate hash, so I need a comma, or I need to actually wrap this hash in braces so that I get a third argument that is another hash? Stuff like that is kind of crap. Like it's ingrained to me as a Rails developer that I just need to do that. But when I explain that to somebody new, like, yeah, this sucks and it's not your fault. It's
Yeah.
just that's how Ruby is, treating the last argument as a hash, and that's how Rails chose to model their API. Anyway, it is what it is. But at some
I remember
point, it's
teaching
kind of
Mark
nice
about
having,
that.
yeah.
Yeah,
At
I
some
was teaching
point,
about
it's
Rails,
nice
and he's always
having,
like, "How do you know that?" And I'm like, "Just do."
yeah, just do, yeah. I've been burned by it a few times. Um, so it's a trade-off. I don't like speaking in absolutes. I am a huge fan of the syntax in Swift. Some of the strict, rigid nature kind of rubs me the wrong way, but in general, it's like a huge improvement over Objective C, experience-wise. That said, Objective C reminded me a lot of Ruby in the you can kind of dynamically swizzle methods. So if there's a class doing something you don't want it to do, you could just like swizzle that method call to do your code instead. And that's a lot of stuff that you could get from Ruby. And not that you would always want to do that in your running application. Like maybe you would just in case, like to get around an edge case bug or whatever. But for testing frameworks, it's like the world is wide open for you to test whatever you want to test. And Swift, none of that is true anymore. You can get some of that back with the bridging to Objective-C stuff I mentioned. But in general, I think what we're going to see is dependency injection containers and testing by isolation. And this stuff, I'm like, I know how to do it, and it doesn't really excite me. But perhaps, perhaps I've grown as a software developer, and maybe I will design better systems. Who knows?
No, we just there's this little cycle, this loop. We keep on repeating the same things over and over again. And like my last couple weeks has been, I knew it when I first saw JSON API. I was like, this looks terrible, and it's gonna be a bad mistake. And then I sort of went through and was like, okay, maybe it's not that bad. No, I'm back to being terrible. I was like, it's so bad. I'm like, I might as well be consuming XML because I was like, at least I have type safety and XLST and all these other cool things. Here I just have this JSON blob that's impossible for me to deal with.
Yeah.
Anyway,
okay, so let's dig into it and just shout out questions when you have them.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open up Terminal, and you guys know what Vagrant is, right?
Yeah, dabble with the virtual machines and stuff, create like boxes and files.
I've got VirtualBox. Vagrant is a sort of front end to that makes it easy to spin up a box, and it's all headless. So you run Vagrant in it, and it gives me a Vagrant file, and so I can open that up, and I can, delete a whole lot of the comments.
So what's the operating system in the VM?
We get to pick. So I'm going to use the Vagrant 4, so Ubuntu. You can use kind of any Linux, but right now you have to use a 64-bit variant. Sorry, it's not Vagrant, it's Ubuntu Trusty.
So Swift isn't tied to like Xcode and tied to Macs in the same way?
No, not anymore. So yeah, so there is Swift inside of Xcode. They call it the Swift toolchain, I think. So there's Swift inside of Xcode, and then there's open source Swift, which is separate. The two share probably 99% of the code base, but they diverge in important ways. And so you can actually configure Xcode to use the open source toolchain when you do your build, which means you can use beta versions of Swift, beta or even alpha, like development versions. So looking at swift.org, we go to the download link, and these are the development snapshots. We've got development snapshots for 1404, which is trusty, 1510, which is, I don't remember what, and they literally won't work right now aside from those two platforms. And that's just the development versions. Eventually, we're going to get more broader support. So, like for instance, if you download this on your flavor of Linux and it doesn't compile, or if it doesn't run, if you get some sort of obscure error, you're either running a 32-bit version of Ubuntu or you're not running one of the supported platforms. So I'm going to copy this link for the development version because I want Swift 3. Swift 3 is the one that contains, let's see if I can notes here. Don't open the last project. That's annoying. Okay. Okay. So if we download the Swift development branch, this is what will be Swift 3. Right now, if you are in Xcode, you have Swift 2.1. I think that's true. Then there's the Swift 2.2 release. I think this is Swift 2.2. In any case, you can get the same Swift 2.2 on Linux. What I want is Swift 3 because it contains the Swift package manager, and it also contains the Foundation project, the Foundation frameworks. That's all the good stuff I mentioned. So, like, in addition to the language, you get a lot of the libraries that make it so cool. You can bring in, I think, both of these into Swift 2.2, but that's more of a manual thing. Swift 3 includes them, so I'm gonna run with that one. So I'm gonna copy the link for 1404. I think we don't need to do anything else in here.
So for the Swift package manager, we live in a package manager world scenario. What would you put in terms of like happiness and quality and so forth? Like,
well, it's so freaking new. It's
Okay.
like brand new. So happiness and quality, I think it's awesome, like utterly awesome that Apple is behind this, and not only Apple behind this, but like there are more than two people, but two people that I know from the community who like will do the right job on this are part of that project.
like so,
Actually,
like getting Cocoa Pods and all that.
I'm sure you've met Matt Triple T Thompson, right?
I think, yeah.
I first met him at Lone Star Ruby Conference many years ago.
Yeah.
And anyway, he now works for Apple on this project, on the Swift Package Manager.
Cool.
So long term, yes, it'll probably replace CocoaPods and Carthage, probably, but that's a long way away. In fact, there's probably more likely to be sort of a bridging between CocoaPods and Swift Package Manager. Also, the word SPM is now overloaded, or the acronym SPM. The NPM has a SPM package for, I don't even know what now, scripts or something. I forget what, static assets, that's what it is. So I'm not sure who will win out, but some people call it SPM, some people just call it Swift Package Manager, whatever. Okay, so I've got my Vagrant VM, and it's like literally vanilla Vagrant. So I'm going to run Vagrant SSH. So apt update. And then there's just a few dependencies that we need. One of them is we'll need Git for Swift Package Manager. /y. We need Git. We need Clang. Clang is the like LLVM compiler. We need libicu dev. And I think there was one more that I'm forgetting. Well, I guess Nginx if we're gonna get as far as a website. Actually, since we'd be running it locally, I wouldn't necessarily need Nginx, but I had to run Nginx in front of the NS date formatter site because the web server wouldn't work with static assets. I tried to get it to work with static assets and handle the route manually, read a file from disk and stream it as text, and that worked. But then when I got to an image, I couldn't return binary because they hadn't built that into the web server yet. So you literally had to return a string from your HTTP handlers.
So this is really early. Like that's like Node 101. Yeah. It's like you build a HTTP server and serve static files.
Yeah. So I mean, and after the project got a lot of press, and so I showed it to the creator of the web framework, and he was like, "Oh, you can do this. Did you know you could do this?" And like he was like super helpful and responsive, and like shortly after that, he had implemented a bunch of the things I was asking for. Okay, so we've got Git, we've got Clang. I'm going to do wget with that Swift URL I copied earlier. and then tar xcdf, and then that. So this gives me pre-built binaries for all this stuff. So at this point, I can go into that Swift folder, and then there's a user bin inside of there. And now here I've got a Swift binary. And the most important tip you will learn today is how to quit. It's :quit, which would probably be the last thing you would try. I'm going to copy this directory, and then I'm going to go into my profile, and I'm going to add it to the path. So this is going to be this $path. And now if I source that be anywhere and run Swift. Here we go. Cool. Everybody with me? No questions?
I think we're okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Took a
So
little bit.
what's that?
It took a little bit for my screen to update.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks
So
good.
if you just run Swift, you get REPL, and it's super similar to IRB. However, every command you type has to then be compiled with the context that you came from. So I think it's a little bit it's interesting to have a compiled REPL, just because some things take a little longer. It's just, I guess, a little interesting problem. But we can just kind of play around with Swift here. So I can say let x equals 5. Say let y equals 6. And by saying let, that means I can't change it after the fact, right? Let means it's a constant. And so there's this.
I like how every language now has their own and contradictory versions of let and var
Yeah.
and const.
Yeah.
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 'Cause that's what we need.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter what it's called, right? But I like the notion that where possible, if you make things immutable, the compiler can make blazing fast choices of how to execute the code you type. But if something might be mutated in the future, all those checks have to be in place to make sure that you're not modifying something at the same time as somebody else, etc. Right? So there's a performance characteristic around your code that the compiler will consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Immutability is something we should strive for for performance and parallelization and things like that. Okay, so if you want to be able to do that, then you'll say var z equals 5, and then later on you can say z is 2, and everything's fine there. You can also see that it inferred the type, so z is an int. I can't then say z is true because z is an int variable. Another thing you can't do, you can assign it to nil. And the reason is that nil doesn't make sense for int. This is sort of more akin to C# where you have nullable of t. If you want a variable to have maybe have a value, then you would say, give me a value a. Type is going to be an optional int, and I'm going to assign it to nil. Now you can say, well, does a have a value or not? And that is a choice that you're going to make as a programmer in order to sort of avoid problems with nil. Right? And nil is kind of an issue in every programming language. And dealing with nil, the absence of a value, is like a really important thing to avoid accidental errors in your programs. By having a separate type, it enforces you to handle the case where this variable might be nil. For example, let me take a function. We declare a function with a func keyword. Let's say I'm going to take it's going to call add. It's going to add two numbers together and return the result, right? So I'm going to have an x value, which is an int, and a y value, which is an int. And that's going to return. So we have this little arrow. That's also going to return an int. So for the body of this method, we're going to return x plus y. Okay, so now I can do add 5 and 1, and sorry, I made a little bit of a goof here. We have named arguments for methods. So I'm going to redeclare this function to not take an external name for that argument. That's probably more explanation that I want to get into at the moment, but in general, you will have named arguments unless you opt out of it, and this is me opting out of it. Let me return that. Okay. So now I should be able to say add 5 and 1, and I get 6. Okay, is everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
All right. So if I try to add A to 3 or 5 or whatever, it's a compiler error because the types don't match up. So that's, the compiler telling you have to handle this case. That it doesn't make sense. In Ruby, this would crash at runtime.
Yeah.
Because A is nil. And if A is nil, what happens when you add to it? And sometimes the answer is, well, let's just call 2i on that. In which case it's 0. And that is just like translating nil to an actual value, which is not great. That's not a great solution to that. So the correct way to do this in Swift is to unwrap the value. So I'm going to say if the new variable name b equals a, then I'm going to print the b plus of adding b to 5. That's right. Okay. This little guy's string interpolation. Okay. If I don't.
Me and George are like, sure, $, £, backslash, whatever. I was like, are we like making some backspace?
So that, yeah,
just curlies now.
Yeah, whatever.
So
double curly,
single
single
interpolation. Okay, so if we don't have a value for a, then we're going to fall into the else block. And then here I'm just going to say can't add. Okay, and so it prints can't add with nil. And the reason why is that a was nil, and so this thing is called optional binding, where you say if let b equals a, b will become a's value, but only if a has a value, right?
Okay.
Okay, so what would the type of b be?
Anything but nil.
Well,
right.
Would it be int? Would it be int question mark?
It wouldn't be int question mark, right? Because otherwise
Right.
it would be able to assign it. So it has to be
Right.
int.
So when we're doing optional binding, it's unwrapping the value and taking the value inside of it, which is an int.
Yeah.
Another way to look at this is int is the same thing as optional int. This is the same thing. Optional is an enumeration. Enumerations in Swift are freaking awesome. They are a special case of struct. So you're familiar with structs, right?
Yeah.
So like I might have a struct like point program, and it might have like a int for x and for y, and now I've got my point struct, and I can say x is 5 and y is 10. That's a struct, and it's immutable by default. But unlike C, we can add methods to points. So you might say, point, I don't know, add to point, which returns another point, for instance. So just so I can show you that, I can create an extension on point, and I can have a func add to, take another point, and this returns a new point, right? This would be, I want to create, we're going to return point where the x self.x plus point.x, and where the y is self.y plus point.y, right?
Okay.
Okay, so now we just created an extension for a point, and now I can say, let me go grab Now I can say p.add to point x is 1 and y is 0. I get a 6 and 10. So again, embracing immutability. This is always returning a new instance, etc. But so this is a struct.
So for the scenario, you can't assign just self x the value because of the let, and when you define your
Correct.
struct. If you assign that as var, would you be able to change it, or is that?
So there's two things that I would have to do there. Yes, I would have to set it as var, but I'd also have to mark this func as mutating. So I would say mutating func. Okay. And that again, it lets the compiler knows that, like, hey, when you call this, it's going to mutate the reference.
Yeah. Not saying I would do that, because that sort of
in addition, if I say var p2 x equals 5, it doesn't work unless I make that var. Okay. But the other interesting thing is that the whole struct becomes read-only if I declare it as let.
Okay.
So there's multiple levels here. The struct's properties can be let or var, and then the pointer to that struct can be let or var. Okay, on to enums. Enum might be like my, I don't know, background color, right? And for me to do this, let me import. Let me think of a better. Well, yeah, I could do this without actual color. So we're going to have an enum called background color, and this is going to represent the colors in our application. It's going to be, well, yeah, I'm just going to have it like this. And we're going to have a case for red. We're going to have a case for green. And that's it. Sorry, no dots. Okay, so now I can say let c equals background color dot red. Now we've got an instance of that enum. Again, being a type-safe language, if I switch on C, there's a known set of values that I could possibly match on. So it's a compile error if you don't handle them all, or provide a default. So now let's say
if you made a little switch statement on background color, it's a compile error if you don't handle all the cases.
Or have a default. So
yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, so like for instance, if you have an enum that handles all of your background colors, and then in some view controller somewhere you're like, hey, I want to switch on my background color. In the case of red, I'm going to set background color to some red color that I know. And in the case of green, I'm going to set background color to some green color I know. And then that's all I write. Later on, if I add a new color, it's going to show me everywhere where I did a switch statement on this enum and make me handle it, which is a good thing to avoid potential errors down the line. In Objective-C and C, there's no such protection, and so adding a new enum case is potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
So let's do another extension on this background color enum. And here, and this method is going to be give me the color name, let's say, and this color name is going to return a string. So here I can switch on self, and if a red, then I'm going to return red. If we are green, I'll return green. And then here's the other part I was saying. In the default case, like if you know that you can sort of have a catch-all for any unknown color, maybe I just return unknown. So that would not end up as a compile error. Okay, so now I can take my color and I can call color name on that. Get back red. Enums are also cool because they can have an associated value. So a good one might be an enum for our HTTP response. And if you can imagine like building an API client, like sorry, an HTTP library,
Yeah.
and you want to communicate back what happened on the server. So there's a bunch of different things. There's response codes, there's response headers, there's response bodies. Um, and if you, let's say you get back a 302, then there's no body. That doesn't even exist. It doesn't make sense. So passing in headers, status code, and a body into like a callback, you're only going to use some of those parameters depending on the situation, right? So in the case of, let's say, success, then we probably want to have a with that, and perhaps nothing else because the status code is just 200. That's not valuable to us. In the case, probably want a string for the new location. And in the case of, I don't know, invalid requests, grid level error, we might want an int for the status code and a string for the body. And there are a bunch of cases like this, right? So let's say I make my request, and then I can say, okay, the response is, and if I know the type of variable, then I can omit calling it with HTTP response dot, and I can just say dot because it can infer it. I can say, okay, the response here is success, and say that there's just some text that says okay. With me so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so here, later on, I want to switch on this value. So I want to switch on R, right? Because if it's an error, I want to print an error message. If it's successful, then I want to continue with whatever operation. So here I can say case dot success, and in this part, I need to like get at that underlying value. I need to get at this string, and to do that, you can give it a name, like give it a variable here. Here I can say print the result was a string and the body is body. And I'm just going to say print not successful. Oh, and this is a compiler error. No, sorry, it is not a compiler error. I was thinking that I needed to call break, but no, that's implicit. Okay, so that's how you assign associated values on enum cases, and sort of get at those values later on when you unwrap the enumeration.
That's pretty cool. Like, I guess with any HTTP library you're consuming on the iPhone and stuff, you can be a little more safe and make sure you handle all the codes right and errors, right?
Right. Now, imagine for a minute. Let's create another enum, and I'm just going to call it capital R because I'm lazy. And let's just say this is literally just modeling a response. Like I'm not going at this high level.
Yeah.
I just want to give you the response. And so let's say the response is. This happens when you're dealing with a library that doesn't even understand about these associated values. Like, in fact, let me just back out of that. Let me just say that our status code is whatever 200, and our body is okay. And later on, I can say, okay, I want to match on. I want to match on something. So I'm trying to think of how best to do this without introducing like known libraries. You can pattern match on a range of values. So I could say if we had a response where we got the status code. In fact, going back up here with the invalid requests, let's do this. Invalid request, and I need to give it the number. So say that was a 422, and add client. So if I switch on R, and I have a case statement for, I want a case for invalid request where the number here is 400 to 422, but not including. And then say I could do underscore because I don't care about this param. Here I could say print got 400 to 421 or whatever.
Wait, so is underscore like whatever
Underscore
the
means
default of the
ignore it.
type is?
No, it's just
Yeah,
like ignore it. I don't even want a variable for it.
But you are in. Oh, wait. This is taking a This is an argument or a parameter? Like, are you taking it
I'm
as
matching.
input, or are you?
I'm matching it.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Like
it's
Elixir.
it's
I was like, this is
yeah,
Elixir,
yeah.
but
I'm
Swift.
matching. Like I don't
Yeah,
care
yeah.
what this one is.
Right,
And
pattern.
and if I wanted to access it, then I'd make a variable for it. But in this case, I'm just saying match it on this range.
Sure.
And then for other stuff. And then, of course, it's an error if I don't have a default. So and a lot of this stuff is a lot easier with Xcode because I may get the syntax wrong like all the time.
I
but-
assume the case statement doesn't fall through like it does.
It doesn't unless you say, I think the keyword is fall through.
Oh, there's an option to do that thing nobody
Yes.
ever wants it to do.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, it might be. It might be. You say like, oh, if I have a case for 200 and a case for 201, but I want them to do the same thing, then maybe you would. But
Yeah,
it's
but do
equivalent.
you?
It's equivalent to just do the range, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
That one time that you might potentially use it, and it's sort of quasi cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna quit out of this, and
I have a question. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Line 78. What is it doing exactly that's different from default? Because it syncs all the other values, doesn't it?
I had other cases besides invalid request. I had success and redirect or whatever. So it's definitely going to match on this enum value, but then it's the associated values. So if I did the same thing and I had a status code of 400, then we would have fallen into this case. If I had, well, we saw the case where I got 422, but if I had like a dot success, then it would have fallen into here.
Oh, yeah.
The reason I put this here is because I didn't want to specify, like fully exhaust the enum.
Got it. One other last question is it possible to name them, the status code and body, in the definition of the enum as opposed to here? Because you're naming it in the consumption, but in the definition it was just types,
I don't think so.
which I'm not used to. Okay.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting. I don't think there's a way to name it.
I've used enums in Java, and there
Uh-huh.
you name them in a special definition method, kind of like a constructor.
Yeah, I think that there's a similar case where you can provide named arguments for blocks, but when you call them, it's like those aren't really helpful. Like you can name it whatever you want because they're your variables, not the block's variables. So I think that if there is a way to do it, it's inconsequential to how you would use it. So you'd probably want documentation.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about like doing programs outside of the Swift REPL. So I'm going to make a directory, and we're going to call it, I don't know, LA Beans. And in here, I'm going to have a main.swift. And sorry, not in there. I'm going to make a directory called sources. This can be called sources, src, source. There's a bunch of different conventions. And the reason why I'm following this convention is because this is what Swift Package Manager will work with. It'll pick it up automatically. So inside of here, let's see. Oh, I totally forgot. I have this awesome gist that I made. Find it. Minimal Vim. This is like the bare essentials for me to tolerate Vim on a Linux VM, and also have Swift. So yeah, you could just run this on your VM, which I'm going to do here. So this is I can just curl-o. Forgetting how I did this last time.
So you said you actually like the Swift syntax quite a bit, and it's moving out of the iOS realm is basically what's happening. Is
I spelled this
and
wrong.
so,
Minimal. Yes, I mean it was never meant to only be for iOS. It was, iOS and Mac
Oh.
obviously is like the home for it. But
Yeah.
if you can imagine, like Apple's got a considerable online presence with iCloud and iTunes and the stores. Those are all done with web objects, which is a technology that we're going to have fewer and fewer experts in.
Yeah.
And I think that Apple's reputation for online services is not great. And at some point, they're going to have to make a decision of what language do we go forward on the server. And the answer, as of probably up to 4 years ago when Swift was started in secret, is that this is going to be a systems language. It's going to be as performant as C. It's going to let us write server applications. I mean, they haven't come out and said this, but
So it's
if you
a
look
Go
at Chris Latner's the designer of the language, if you look at his early comments about Swift and the purpose and everything, it is so much bigger than Objective-C applications, or sorry, iOS applications and Mac applications. It's meant to be a systems language. From the get-go, they wanted to open source it. They announced that they were going to open source it very shortly after it was released in general.
But we're basically talking a Go competitor here, right? And maybe Rust.
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that, because I haven't done
I'm not
Go
qualified
or
to
Rust.
ask it, but
I will say that there is focus on many levels to make it work as a good server-side framework for web applications or services, online services, that sort of thing. Who knows? I mean, if the Swift community goes all JavaScript on us, then we're going to see Linux ports and Bash shell replacements and stuff written in Swift, which is not going to be productive. But I'm certain that we could do such things. Okay, so I've got. Let me remove my minimal Vim.
yeah, and I want to encourage, by the way, anyone else here who wants to ask questions or Ben of this stuff, please do.
All right, so if I want to import Foundation, I can do so, and that gives me access to things like NS Date Formatter, which is awesome. So I'm going to say, give me let's see, a date today.
Hey, Ben, I know a site you can use so you know what string to use inside there. It's pretty awesome.
Date format. Go ahead and check this out. Yeah, this is exactly why I wrote this, because I want this one. That looks good. Yoink. And I give it my date format string. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with Objective-C, but let me just write the same thing in Objective-C.
Do we have enough screen space and time for that?
Sorry, I even forget how. All right, so there's that. Then NSDate formatter equals NSDate format. Would have helped me prepend this thing when I add the second one at the end. Equals that semicolon. I mean, it's that I shouldn't complain. It's not the end of the world, and people build entire great applications using this. But over time, I'm not missing the square brackets. I'll just say that. And
Objective-C wasn't all bad, but you can definitely say there's a lot of noise.
Yeah. So, for instance, there's the reason why is because this is a C string. It's literally the type of this is char star. and under the hood has to be nil terminated and all that stuff. So yeah, no thanks. I don't really need to deal with that anymore. Okay. Formatter, date format, and now I'm just going to say, we're going to say print the date is, and string, this is going to be formatter. Sort of notice that Swift is pretty concise, when you start working with foundation frameworks, they're pretty verbose. And that was just a design choice in Objective-C, is to have like very, very descriptive variable names and arguments. So that's why you get the reputation for having like super long method names, which is sometimes helpful. In any case, I can say date, and now I can say the date is date string. Cool. All right. The one other thing I need is a package.swift, and it can be empty. And I'm going to run Swift build. So Swift build is Swift package manager. In the same sense that I can pull in dependencies, I can use Swift package manager to build a module that is suitable for exporting or suitable for using in other projects. And it knew what to build because of convention. If we look at swift.org, there's the package manager link. This is definitely worth a read for like how they envision this package manager. In any case, what this did, if we look in here, we've got a build folder. Look in there, we've got a debug. That was our configuration that we built. And if we look in there, we've got, hey, an executable. So I can do build, debug, jelly beans, and we got our output.
Fancy.
Pretty awesome. Okay, so now I want to create an API, because this is 2016, and your Hello World has to be an API. By the way, what time do we have to wrap up?
Technically, like 7 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And also,
well, you know what?
Let's do a basic, do a basic one with C, and we can always have you come out later again, and we'll do even more awesome things.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to create a package. It's going to be called Jelly Beans, because I don't know why. And it's going to have dependencies. And for the dependencies, I'm going to copy what I had.
I know why it's jelly beans. Because see, you're iOS Swift guy, and you're like, you know what? I'm jealous that I can't do web work. So now you're doing web work in Swift, and then you're like, you know what? I really dig the Android names, so I'm just gonna be like jelly beans and peanut butter chocolate Reese's Pieces peanut butter cup version 2.
Okay. So on GitHub, and it's got very similar like semver versioning requirements. But again, this is strongly typed, so there's actually a version where you can say 031 or whatever, and you can even have a range of versions, so you can do ... version whatever. So you can be super specific of what versions you want. In my case, I'm like, give me at least version 0.3. And then here, when I run Swift build, it's going to clone that repo, link the module. The module is something that I didn't implicitly create, but you could see somewhere in here when I did my first build, it compiled a module called Jelly Beans, because that's the name of my folder. If you have subfolders inside of sources, you'll go to module for each one, and these are a ton of warnings because I'm using a super bleeding edge version of Swift, so a lot of these things are actually changing right now. And I think now I can go into my just real quick. Curacao is like unicorn. Frank is like Sinatra. Nest and Inquiline are kind of like rack. And Commander is a command line thing. So that's where those things come from.
Like Ruby Commander. Commander's like Commander.
Or Commander in Ruby? I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to
You've got a question just in the Slack of actually asking, is Swift garbage collected?
It is automatic reference counting, so no garbage collection. It is like way better than garbage collection.
How so?
Well, garbage collection is not a great idea.
Period. Full stop.
Period. Full stop. No, I think we've proven over the many, say, 4 years since we've had automatic reference counting that garbage collection is literally not necessary to build modern applications. I mean, I guess it's a bold statement, but I haven't really thought about memory management in a super long time.
Sure.
When things go out of scope, they get cleaned up. If you want them to stick around, you create strong references to them. You just have to take care not to create cyclical dependencies. But that's easy enough to recognize when you're doing that sort of thing. That I haven't found this to be an issue at all.
Memory management, like Ruby, that's the same thing. Memory management is not important. Just stick more RAM into it. I mean, just whatever, you know.
Well,
But in Ruby, you have a garbage collection, and if like big sites like GitHub and whatever, they measure GC and they tune their GC so that like all of a sudden I need to clean up a bunch of objects. That's going to make like Joe's request take 400 milliseconds longer. You know, it's I shouldn't say it's like categorically bad, but I am in favor of Swift's model and Objective-C's model of automatic reference counting. It's like you get the benefit of manual memory management, so everything is pretty precise and tight in terms of cleaning up variables when they're no longer used, with a deterministic model, whereas garbage collection is not deterministic, right? It happens at some arbitrary point in the future. Okay, so at this point, instead of printing, I am going to just return. Well, I'll just return my date string. Okay, hopefully this works. Build and run. I think I'm good. Real quick. This is a little bit confusing. That takes a block, and the arguments to the block are like this. And keyword in separates the block's arguments from the block body. Okay. I think this is probably the grossest part about Swift, honestly. It just doesn't look like other languages. But in Ruby, this would be like get, do, request, or something.
Yeah.
Or do I even have that backwards? I don't even know. Okay.
No, that works.
Okay. Let's try and run it. So I'm going to run Swift build again. And I didn't import my framework. Import frame. Needed? Yeah, I think so. Build. Run it again. All right, boom, it's listening. It's Vagrant SSH again. And curl localhost. Allison? Boom.
Genius. Look, and you did it just in time.
Yeah.
Just in time. All right, I have 1 minute for questions.
And done. No. I'll tell you what, Frank, those are going to mess me up all the time you mention it, because so Ryan, way back in the day, probably still has a project or whatever, like was doing a F# implementation of Sinatra, and he called it.
I remember.
So every time, Frank, I'm like, F#? When did that? Oh,
yeah. But, I mean, eventually, as a species, we like run out of kitschy names for things.
Wait, yeah. So I can tell you, working with Phoenix, I think naming things after cities is not going to be a helpful thing, because every time you search for Phoenix, it's like Phoenix, Arizona. You're like, no. Nothing. Absolutely nothing to do with Phoenix, Arizona.
Well, naming your programming language after one of the most popular pop artists of all time is also not good.
Yeah,
you're like Swift Web, and you're like Taylor Swift's web page on the internet.
You're like, don't. Or naming
the Swift newsletter.
Elixir strings is another great one, because they're like, you want guitar strings? You're like, no.
Yeah, I have Elixir strings. That's funny. No, Swift is a cool language. It's obviously more relevant to somebody doing iOS and Mac development, but I'm pretty excited about just having like another option for the server, especially because this NS date formatter thing would not be possible to do this. Well, I can't say that. It would not be feasible or worth my time doing it if I had to create some sort of Frankenstein's monster of like a Rails app that like somehow shells out to a Mac Mini running Xcode in order to get a date format string. Like, anyway, it just seemed like this was a good a way to just sort of show off that, like, hey, NS date formatter is a thing we have to use a lot, and now I can show it on the server like live.
See, you could have just done it all JavaScript. and
And
then like
formats.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, you have to like re-implement it. But
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at an hour right now. I guess. Is there any questions from anyone anytime soon? I think next time we'll definitely leave more room for people to kind of show anything else.
and we would try to promote things a little bit better.
Yeah.
I've been so busy, it's been crazy.
Yeah, but also if you do have something you want to show off, please put it in that form so we can kind of figure it out.
Yeah. And I will point out that the JavaScript presenter that we had was doing mobile apps, and then the mobile presenter we had was doing web apps. So we're all mixed up. We're just like, do whatever the heck you want. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining. Again, this thing is recorded. Feel free to share. Ben, thank you so much for coming and talking and sharing everything. I knew Ben would not be promoting his stuff, so I'm going to promote it again. NSScreencast are awesome. Be sure to check them out. Also, check out NS Date Formatter and the website, and then also look at the bottom and go, oh, look, hey, he built this, and you should check out the screencast. They are great. They're good for learning mobile stuff, and it's been fantastic watching that grow from Ben's idea going, should I do this, to like, yes, and big success. In fact, we have Josh here, and he's going to be our speaker next week. And Josh and Jason are doing XCast, and so they're like 3 years behind where Ben was, or I guess more now. Like time flies. Like just starting out and having the passion and putting together the material and putting that quality into it. So they're going to share Elixir stuff and get us up to speed with what's going on in that world. So see y'all next week. Thanks again, everybody, and later.
Cool. Thanks.